On behalf of the Texas Regional Alliance for Campus Sustainability, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Fall 2022 TRACS Virtual Student Summit. My name is Richard Johnson. I'm the Executive Director for Sustainability at Rice University, and I, along with Kelly Wellman of Texas A&M, serve as co-chair of the TRACS executive team. I am joined today by several amazing student leaders from campuses across the state who have spent the past several months organizing today's event. TRACS was formed in 2008 and is an organization where Texas higher education sustainability leaders are able to connect, engage, and collaborate on sustainability challenges facing our campuses. Today's event marks our second program designed to center student voices in our TRACS conversations. Your student peers have put together an excellent lineup for you today. But before we get started, I want to cover a few logistics. We are recording today's event and we'll make those links available to attendees in a follow-up email. Please consider leaving your camera on. We have found that this helps to facilitate a sense of community. The live transcript feature has been enabled. You have the ability to disable that feature by finding the CC icon on your toolbar, selecting the caret up or down, and picking Hide Transcript. If it isn't already, I would encourage you to select the side-by-side mode found in your toolbar viewing options so that you have the optimal screen experience. Now, I would like to turn it over to my neighbor, Samara Zuckerbrod of the University of Texas at Austin. Samara, thank you so much to you and to your fellow student leaders for organizing today's event.
Hi, thanks for that great introduction. I just want to thank everyone on the call who helped plan the conference. First, please introduce yourselves as the conference goes along. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Mr. Maltby, who's our keynote speaker for the day, and let him begin. My name's Samara. I'm from the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm a senior sustainability studies student, and I'll be leading the keynote portion. Just so everyone knows, please leave your comments in the chat if you have any questions during the presentation, and Mr. Maltby will take 10 minutes of questions at the end. Also, feel free to join the conference as you have time throughout the afternoon. It's a 4-hour conference. We're first going to open with the keynote, and then we have an awesome presentation of workers' rights advocates, and Haley can speak more to that. We also have student presentations. Students from across Texas are going to present on work equity or social justice issues. And then the conference will end with a salary and benefits negotiation. So feel free to join for whatever parts you can make. And now to introduce the keynote, Mr. Maltby is the president of the National Work Rights Institute. Before founding the NWI, he was the director of the ACLU's National Employment Rights Office. Maltby has testified before Congress numerous times on a wide variety of employment issues, and he's been interviewed by the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, as well as appeared on television shows from 60 Minutes to Oprah. He's the author of Can You Do That? Reclaiming Our Fundamental Rights in the Workplace. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Lewis Maltby. And Mr. Maltby, please take a second to introduce yourself as well before I bring up your slides.
Thank you, Samara. Very happy to be here. It's nice to be here because everybody cares about employment rights at work when something bad happens to them, but most of the time we don't think about it. And when it happens is because we don't think about it much, nothing changes. So every opportunity to bring it up and talk about it is an opportunity to make things a little bit better. So can we have this first slides now?
Yes, one moment.
Sure. Oh, now I can do it. So what we're talking about today is human rights at work. And several years ago, a woman named Lynn Goebel pulled into her parking lot at work. And as she was walking into the building, she encountered her boss. And her boss noticed she had a bumper sticker on her car for a presidential candidate that the boss didn't like, not at all. He told her to take the bumper sticker off, and she said, I'm not taking the bumper sticker off my car. This is America. I have a right to express my opinion. And he fired her. And I have two questions for all of you. First question is, was that a legitimate thing for her boss to do? Is that something a boss should be able to do? And question number 2 is, was it legal? I'll give you a second to think about it. I can't see too much of the faces. So if there's someone out there who thought it was illegal, can you chime in either in the chat box or by speaking? Anybody?
Richard says illegal.
Ah, okay. And Richard, why do you think it was illegal for the boss to fire her?
Well, I'm going to guess that because it was not related to workplace performance.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Don't feel bad, Richard. I've asked that question to literally thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people over the years, and everybody gets it wrong. Everybody says, well, that was not a legitimate thing to do. And secondly, everyone I've ever asked this question to, virtually everyone says it wasn't legal. And here's the bad news. It may have been wrong, but it was absolutely legal. Her boss didn't violate any law at all in firing her because he didn't like the bumper sticker on her car. And what people frequently say, somebody may be thinking is, well, what happened to about freedom of speech? Samara? Freedom of speech comes, of course, from the Constitution, the First Amendment. And here's what the First Amendment says. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. The magic word being Congress. Lynn Goebel worked in the private sector. She didn't work for Congress. And over the years, courts have interpreted the word Congress to mean not just Congress, but a state legislature or even a local government as well. But you can't read Congress to include private parties. You can't read Congress legitimately to include private corporations. And courts haven't read the First Amendment to mean something it clearly doesn't mean. You don't have any constitutional rights at work. The concept of constitutional rights at work, I'm sorry to say, is an oxymoron. There's no such thing because the Constitution doesn't apply to private employers. Now, everybody thinks, gosh, but Congress has passed all these statutes. Do we have any rights at all? And the answer is yes. Can we see the statutes? There are countless federal statutes giving us rights at work. Civil Rights Act of 1964, covering race and gender and some other things. The Age Discrimination and Employment Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and most recently, Genetic Non-Discrimination Act. And you notice there's 5 different, but they all cover discrimination. All they say is that you can't discriminate on a certain basis. That's all they say. It doesn't give you any right except the right not to be discriminated against based on a particular condition. Next slide, please. And we do have some other statutes as well. There are so many of them. We have Minimum Wage Act. We have the Family Medical Leave Act, which you're probably familiar with, and the National Labor Relations Act that gives people the right to form a union, at least in theory. Okay. But if you go back and look at those, there's nothing in there that says that your boss can't read your personal email. None of those statutes talk about that. There's nothing that says that your boss can't eavesdrop on personal telephone calls you make at work. There's nothing in there that says your boss can't track your internet visits. Okay, Samara. And There's nothing in those statutes that says that your boss needs a legitimate reason to fire you or even a work-related. Your boss can fire you because he had a fight with his wife this morning, or she had a fight with her husband, and they're taking it out on you. And even if you could prove it, there's nothing you can do about it. And just to show you how dramatic this is, if in 1963, if you were African American and you went to court and said, my boss fired me because I'm Black, and the judge turned to your boss and said, did you fire him because he's Black? And the boss says, yes, I fired him because he's Black, because I don't like, let us be polite and say, African American people. The judge would have said, oh, okay, fine, case dismissed. It wasn't illegal to fire somebody because of their race until 1964, when Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 64, making it illegal to fire somebody because of their race. Until that happened, you could fire somebody because their race or their religion or their gender, admit it in court, and have the case dismissed. That's the situation we've got. And every time somebody like me tries to change the law so that you can't fire somebody for a completely unfair reason, here's what we get. This is a direct quote from a Congressman, William Taylor. If this legislation becomes law, what it will do to the economic stability of America, no one can predict. Oh my God, sounds like the sky is going to fall. Sounds like our economy is going to become a basket case. What do you think Congressman Taylor was talking about? You won't be able to guess, so I'll tell you. He was talking about the Civil Rights Act of 64. Congressman Taylor stood up in front of Congress and said, if you make it illegal for people to get fired because of their race, our economy is going to fall apart. It's going to be a disaster. I mean, it sounds pretty ridiculous. It is pretty ridiculous. But every time, I've been doing this for 30 years now, 32. Every time I stand up in front of Congress or a state legislature and say, employers shouldn't be able to do this or shouldn't be able to do that, this is what we get. Oh, you're interfering with the freedom of enterprise. You're interfering with the free market. We're all going to be living in caves if you pass this. And the reason that appeal is so powerful is because the American people may not all be economics majors, but they understand that market economies work better than economies that are run by the government. The Russian economy is not exactly a thing of beauty. The Chinese economy only became as powerful it is when Zhou Enlai decided, or excuse me, Deng Xiaoping decided they should stop having the government run the economy and let private sector make the decisions. I am the last person in the world to say we should have government bureaucrats making resource allocation decisions. Socialism is pretty, capitalism is ugly, but market economies are more productive. It's just so clear. But here's where Congressman Taylor is getting it wrong. Human rights in the workplace isn't socialism. You don't have to interfere with an employer's right to make business decisions to say you can't fire somebody because of their race. You're not interfering with legitimate business decisions that say you can't fire somebody because of their politics. You're not interfering with legitimate business decisions to say you can't read somebody's personal email that they sent just because they happen to do it on the job. We don't have to choose between prosperity and human rights in the workplace. It's a false dichotomy, and it's time we got rid of it. It's time we left our market economy in place with better safety net for the people who don't do that well in the competition, and recognize that rights like freedom of speech and privacy and due process fit perfectly well into a market economy. If anything, if Adam Smith were still alive, he would see an employer firing somebody for their politics and say, this is terrible. This is not how a private sector is supposed to work. This is not a rational economic actor making good business decision. This is a boss screwing his own company by firing a productive employee because of politics. This sort of thing that happened to Goebel is actually anti-capitalistic. So the question now becomes, assuming you don't like it, what can you do about it? You've now heard the bad news. The good news is that we live in a democracy, a very flawed democracy to be sure, but a democracy just the same. One thing you can do, and 40% of you didn't do it last week, is vote. If you take a minute to look at the candidates in any election, you will find that one of them has a much better record in terms of protecting human rights at work than the other. It's not the only issue out there. There's other issues I know you care about. But when you think about who you're going, well, first of all, just vote, or you're part of the problem. And when you vote, if to the extent that you care about having some human rights at work, look at the track records of the two candidates. One will be much better than the other, and take it into consideration. It sounds simple, but most people don't do it. Second thing you can do is write your congressman. People say, oh, what's the point? Congressmen don't listen to their constituents. Wrong, 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 wrong. I worked in Congress, not for Congress, but with Congress for many years. And every morning, every member of Congress has a staff member walk in and says, Congressman, here's the mail. Here's the issues that we got mail on. Here's how many letters or emails or phone calls we got. And here's how many were on this side of the issue. And here's how many were on that side of the issue. And it doesn't automatically go from there to how they're going to vote. But every day, every congressman asks the staff, what are my constituents telling me about how they feel on the issues? And they don't get that much mail. It's not like your congressman's going to get 10,000 emails tomorrow about everything. And the number of emails your congressman or congresswoman gets on a particular issue, particularly an employment issue like changing the minimum wage, you could probably count on your fingers and toes. So not only do the messages get read collectively, but the numbers aren't that big. Your email to your congressman actually means something. And if you see something going on in Congress or your state legislature in the newspaper or on the radio, and you have a feeling about it, tell your representative how you feel. It's not that hard. It used to be you had to get a pencil or a typewriter and type it out and put it in an envelope and put a stamp on it. Now it takes literally a minute, 1 minute. Go to your computer, Google your congressman or state representative's name. They all have websites, every last one of them, and they'll have a place for constituent input. You can type your message in 30 seconds and push send, and you're done. 1 minute. And you can make your voice heard. And if 1/10 of the people who think that you shouldn't be able to be fired because your boss doesn't like your political support candidate were to say something to Congress, it would change. The reason we still have employment at will is that hardly anybody ever tells their congressman that they think it's wrong. As the cartoonist Walt Kelly once said, we have met the enemy and he is us. There are some times where Congress knows how the American people think and they don't vote the right way because of economic contribution from special interest. It happens. But that's not what's happening here. The core reason that Congress and state legislatures don't do anything to improve protection for human rights at work is that they think their constituents don't care because their constituents don't tell them that they do. Ultimately, it's up to us to tell our representatives in Congress and state legislatures that we don't want to be living in a dictatorship when we go to work. We want to have our constitutional rights mean something when we go to work. Now, that's the macro picture. At a more personal level, there are some things you can do to protect yourself a little bit in the world of work. One of them relates to credit. You would think that unless you're working in a bank or some other kind of financial job, that your boss wouldn't care about your credit score. No, he shouldn't, but they do. Most employers run a credit check on prospective employees, and if your credit score is bad, they're not going to hire you. Why you can't get a job driving a truck because your credit score is bad, you'd have to ask an employer or a psychiatrist. I can't tell you, but it will happen. The good news is you can do something. Oops, not quite. The good news is you can do something about it. You can get a copy of your credit report for free from annualcreditreport.com, or you can call them on the phone at that number. You can get a free copy of your credit report. And when you get it, I will bet you money and give you odds there will be some mistakes in it. Credit reporting companies don't have any quality control. Somebody says you didn't pay a bill when you were supposed to, into the computer it goes, and out it goes when somebody asked about your credit. Nobody's checking to see if it's true. So when you get the credit report, look it over, and when you find the things that are wrong, there's a procedure where you can get it corrected. It's a little more difficult than it ought to be, but it works. You can get the credit report fixed and keep it from costing you a job in the future. Now, Samara. This one's really almost embarrassing to have to talk about. The internet. The internet was supposed to be the place that everybody can make their views known to the world, and now everybody's got a voice. You don't need to own a printing press to tell the world what you think about something. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, that's not quite the way it works. Employers now frequently, and it's a growing number, will Google an applicant for a job. If there's anything that they find on your Facebook page or your personal blog or anywhere else that would embarrass your grandmother, it will probably cost you the job. I know an employer who's otherwise a perfectly reasonable, fair guy, kind of guy I would like to work for, who will, if his top candidate, the one he really hopes will take the job, has a picture of their Facebook page of themselves at a party. Just at a party, their resume goes in the wastebasket. And I quizzed him on it. And he said, well, I said, Don, you go to parties. You don't care they go to parties. And he goes, yes, but I don't put it on my Facebook page. They're putting themselves at a party on their Facebook page, makes me think they're a party animal. I don't want to hire a party animal. It's ludicrous, but that really happened. And he's a pretty fair-minded guy. There was a teacher in Pittsburgh named Stacy Snyder who got fired because she had a picture of herself on her webpage of herself with a pirate hat drinking a beer. She was over 21 and she's from Pittsburgh. What kind of a hat did they expect her to wear? A cheese head? And she got fired and she couldn't get her job back. When my son was applying for college, I literally forced him to take the picture of himself drinking a beer in his studio off of his Facebook page because I knew he wouldn't get into college if some admissions officer saw it. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but if you're applying for a job, take a look at the internet, and if there's anything in there that isn't perfectly on the straight and narrow, take it down at least temporarily. Okay, and last, but not least, this is a real pitfall. Drug testing, especially pre-employment drug testing, is still very, very common. And if you test positive, you're not going to get the job. I don't care if you graduated from Rice summa cum laude and they were down on their knees praying you'd accept the job offer. You have test positive for marijuana, they're going to tear up the offer letter, throw it in the wastebasket. And even if you're applying for a job in a state where marijuana is legal, it doesn't change a thing. All a legalization law says, even the strongest one, is the police can't arrest you for smoking pot. It doesn't say your boss can't fire you for smoking pot. And it doesn't say they can't turn you down for a job because you were smoking pot over the weekend. The legalization only affects your relationship with the police. It doesn't affect employment. And do not look in the back page of the Rolling Stone and clip out that little ad that says, oh, give us $19.95, we'll give you something you can drink, it will make you pass the drug test. It doesn't. They don't work. You're just wasting your money and you'll still lose the job. The answer is very simple. If you're looking for a job, you just had the interview and it went well, develop a taste for beer or martinis or something else, something legal. And by the time they get around issuing the offer letter and you get hired and you go in to take the pre-employment drug test, you'll pass. Anything you might have been doing a couple of weeks earlier will long since be out of your system. And after you've got the job, you can do whatever you like without worrying about it. Okay, Samara. And this is one maybe you already know, but it's so important, I want to be sure. If anything and everything you do on your office computer network is not private. If you're at work and you want to send a very personal email to your husband, your wife, your doctor, your lawyer, switching to your personal Gmail account before you send that message doesn't change anything. The email is still going through the company server, and somebody in IT can and frequently will read it. So if you want to communicate privately at work, today it's simple. Get off your office computer, get on your cell phone, and send the email or the text from your cell phone, and don't use your employer's hotspot. If you do it that way, your boss cannot legally or practically know anything about that communication. So privacy at work you can actually have. And by the way, in case you don't know it, if you're working remotely and you're on the company, you answer your company email on your home computer, your computer at home is now part of the office network. If you decide to send that email to your husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend from your home computer while you're still logged on to the office network, that is now wide open to your boss and IT. It's not hard. Just remember, if you're working at home and you're sending emails, get off the company network before you start sending personal stuff. Just remember, and you'll be fine. Okay. And last but not least, look before you leap when you're taking a job. I used to be in the private sector, and I was just astonished that the dichotomy between how carefully we thought about applicants and how superficially they thought about us. Before I hired anybody, I talked to everybody they ever worked for. Everybody. Because I wanted to know what kind of employee they were. In 13 years running an HR department, to the best of my knowledge, nobody ever called any of our employees to find out what kind of a company we were to work for before they took a job offer. All they knew is like, how much money did we offer them? If we offered them 1,000 more than somebody else, they took the job. If we offered them 1,000 less than somebody else, they didn't take the job. I even offered people, I said, if you'd like to know what kind of a company this is to work for, I'll give you a list of some of our I'll give you our employment list. I'll give you all the ones who've agreed to have their phone number public. You can go home and call a few of them and ask them what it's like to work here. Nobody ever took us up on it. All companies are not the same to work for. Some will fire you for no legitimate reason at all. And some have very good policies to only fire you for a legitimate job-related reason. Some of them protect privacy, some don't. It's not that hard to find out more about a company before you take that job offer. There's more than just a paycheck involved. If you're in a position where you're not desperate and have to take the first job offer you get, if you have the luxury of having more than one potential job, check the companies out, because you'll probably find that some of them do a much better job of protecting your rights, whether or not they legally have to, than others. It makes a lot of difference. And now I think we have some time for questions. Richard, Samar, I can't hear anybody.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to ask Mr. Malfi a question, please unmute yourself or send it in the chat. We have about 20 minutes for questions, so feel free to ask whatever you'd like about workers' rights. And also, Mr. Malfi has written a book on this and has done a lot of advocacy for particular cases, so you can ask about that. Richard asked in the chat, how do you see workers' rights evolving in the future regarding federal legislation?
There isn't any significant federal legislation pending now to improve human rights at work. Nothing. I'm sorry to say it, but it isn't even on the radar screen. The economy is on the radar screen. The Biden administration did a lot to try to help people financially get through the financial shock of the pandemic. So. Are we still here?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. So the Biden administration did a great deal to try to help people financially get through the economic shock of the pandemic, which obviously was extremely important. But what you talk about legislation to give you some free speech rights at work, to increase your privacy at work, to say that your boss can't fire you without a legitimate work-related reason. There are thousands of bills pending in Congress. Most of them aren't getting any attention at all. There aren't even any bills pending on this. This is simply not on the political radar screen because people aren't telling their congressmen that it matters to them. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it's really not a topic that Congress pays much attention to, unless we make them pay attention to it.
Kelly has a question. I'll let Kelly go first.
Hi, Mr. Maltby. Thanks so much. I think, well, I'm not the only one who's surprised when you find out, sure, you can be terminated for a bumper sticker. Having worked in government always, I think I've probably been afforded a fewer different protections than maybe private sector, but My question kind of goes back to when you were talking about us being more, I think, interactive and contacting our congressperson. And I'm curious because it is a lot easier now to send an email. Do you think there's any substantive difference between, number one, maybe actually receiving a written letter? So that was one thought I had is, yes, I can fire off emails, and I've done so. I feel like I get form responses back. And so I didn't know if maybe it's more meaningful to take the time to write and mail something in. So that's part one. And then part two is, what role do you think there is from actually going to visit in person? And does it make a difference if you're doing it in your home district or if you're actually making the trek, say, to the Capitol?
That's a great question. And by the way, just to start with, this bleak picture I painted is of the private sector. If you work for the government, it's different. Because if you go back, the Constitution says that the government can't punish you or censor you or violate your privacy. Well, if you work for the government, then if you're fired for one of these reasons, it's still congressional action. So it's not the Garden of Eden working for the government, but even from a human rights standpoint, but you're much, much better off from a human rights on the job standpoint if you're working in the public sector as opposed to the private sector. The other question is that members of Congress, they're pretty smart about this. What they want to know is, do you care? If you say nothing, they assume they don't care. You don't care. The more effort you put into telling them you care, the more seriously they take it. If you were actually to knock on their door in Washington and you're from Texas to go in and talk to them, they're going to be impressed. If you visit the home office, they won't be as impressed, but they'll be impressed. A letter is better than an email, and a personal email is better than the thing you just point and click on. But most of the time, you don't have time to write a letter. So if you don't have time to write a letter, do whatever you have time to do. Even the ones where you just sign the petition and click it. It doesn't have as much impact as the personal email, but if you don't have time to stop in what you're doing and take 5 minutes to write the personal email, click on the email that somebody sent you and join in. The important thing is to do something and do whatever you have time to do. Don't worry about, oh, I'll wait until I have time to write a letter. No, don't wait till you have time to write a letter. Send the email now and write the letter later if you have time. That's the thing to do. Just do what you have time to do and do something.
Mr. Maltby, Haley asked in the chat, could you tell us more about your work with the Work Rights Institute and how you're basically, I'm speaking for her, but how you're putting what you spoke to us today about into practice in advocating for individuals?
Well, our model is like this. We're not a large organization. And like the ACLU from which we came, we don't have enough members who vote to make a lot of difference. And we don't have a PAC. We don't have enough money to have a PAC, and we wouldn't have one if we did have the money. So what we do is, first of all, we try to get an issue and bring it to the attention of the public. And sometimes it just gets lucky. We gave a talk at a New York State Bar Association meeting some years ago, and it turned out there's a reporter from the New York Times in the audience, and they came up and talked to us afterward. Next thing you know, there's an article in the New York Times about your boss reading your email. This is back when that was relatively unknown. And the next morning, the phone rang, and it was Senator Schumer's office, thinking this was terrible, and they wanted us to come down and help them write a bill. So we did. So we speak to journalists every chance we get, speak at conferences like this one every chance we get, trying to get issues on the political map. And then when somebody in Congress decides they care about it, we switch hats and we become effectively a consultant. In this particular case, Senator Schumer knew that he didn't like the fact that bosses could read people's personal emails and not even tell them what they were doing. But he didn't know how to write a bill about it. He'd never even thought about it before. It was all news to him when he saw it in the papers. So our job was to help him write the bill. And then, of course, once the bill gets into play in the Congress or your state legislature, people like Congressman Kramer are going to start saying how terrible it is and how awful the world will be if this bill gets passed. And they'll make up all sorts of arguments why it's a bad idea. And our job becomes telling Senator Schumer or whoever else it may be, here's why these arguments are wrong, and draft their talking points for them. That's really what our role comes down to. It's get the issues on the map. And then when the politicians start to care about it, we become essentially unpaid staff doing bill drafting and testimony drafting and helping them draft answers to challenges that come up. It's long, slow work, but sometimes it worked. In 1990, we were asked to attend a conference in Washington organized by something called the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, which was Congress's private think tank. Because at that time, there were some real breakthroughs in genetic science starting to happen, and some folks in Congress wanted to know what the implications were. And I hadn't thought about it much either, but I got down to the conference and found out that geneticists at that point basically had learned how to decode the human genome. And we thought about it for a minute, said, wait a minute. Once they decode the genome, they're going to find genes linked to Huntington's and Breastheimer's and Alzheimer's. We know these diseases are genetically linked. There's genes out there someplace, and they're going to get found. And eventually, employers will be able to test for them without spending a fortune in the process. And oh my God, if your woman is walking around with one of the two genes left of breast cancer, you'll be unemployable. So in 1990, we started a campaign to change that. And 18 years later, in 2008, President Bush Jr. signed a law that Congress passed to say you can't do that anymore. Employers can no longer use or even acquire genetic information about you. So if you're carrying one of these genes that's linked to a horrible and expensive disease, you don't have to worry about job discrimination anymore. So that's a description of the role that we play, and sometimes we make a difference.
Kelly's raising her hand, but I'm going to read Richard's question first. Are any state or local governments taking the lead in issues of workers' rights in the private sector?
Sometimes they do. There's 50 states, and it's not as hard to get a bill going in a state as it is in Congress. And some states are a little more friendly to workers' rights than others. Texas is not one of them, but you might end up working in California. And actually, the issue that's getting the most attention in state legislatures today is legalization. Now, that's not an employment question, but if a state legislature is considering saying we're going to stop arresting people and throwing them in jail for smoking pot on Saturday night, maybe we should think about employment while we're at it. And some states, such as New Jersey, where I'm from, when the legislature passed the marijuana legalization bill, they simultaneously said, and while your boss can fire you for being stoned at work, your boss can't fire you just because you peed in the jar and it came up positive. So that's an area the legalization of marijuana is all over the country. It's not going to be long before almost every state's going to have legalized marijuana. The question is, are state legislatures going to say anything about employment when they do it? Generally, they haven't, but it's partially because nobody's raised the question. If you've got a state legislature that says, we don't care if folks smoke pot or drink beer, which they choose on Saturday night, you can't bust people for smoking pot anymore. If citizens were to say, well, while you're at it, how about not firing us for smoking pot on Saturday night? You just might get some attention. That's an issue that's out there where you could actually have some traction.
Kelly, I know you had your hand raised. Did you have another question?
Here's a little bit of a follow-up on, I hadn't really thought about it before, but all these computer algorithms. So I do a lot of work at home. I'm not necessarily on my work network, but we use Gmail and Google Drives. And so I was at first amazed when I'd be at home and make a purchase and then come to work and then get ads on my work computer for things I had purchased at home. So it made me wonder if that translates over. Is that something that's distinguishable? I guess now I'm becoming paranoid over my personal connections.
It's not paranoia when they're really after you. I don't know how that works. I'm 75 years old. I was raised with little things called pencils with graphite and rubber at the other end. Computers will always be terra incognita to me. I do not know how you can buy something on your personal network and it shows up in email on your company account. I don't know how that happens. I'm not sure the boss is really the culprit here, but I just don't know. There's another thing that, from a practical perspective, you might be able to do. Depending on where you work and what kind of relationship you have with your boss. And when it's gray, it's black. Unless you're sure you have this kind of relationship with your boss, don't say anything. Bosses are so touchy about this stuff, it's just astonishing. There was a guy once, there was something frustrating at work. He cut out that day's edition of Dilbert from the newspaper and put it on the bulletin board. And the boss was so offended by the obvious analogy, he tracked down the guy who posted the Dilbert comic and fired him. So don't do this unless you're really sure you can talk to your boss about things. But if you can, you could ask questions like, boss, what are the privacy policies here? So I'm sure you need to read my emails that I send from office from time to time. I know there are times when you need to do it, but how does it work? Who gets to read my emails and when do they get to read my emails? And it's entirely possible that your boss never thought about it. He goes, well, we don't have any rules. When I have a concern, I tell IT and they do something about it. Or maybe IT does stuff on their own initiative. And if you were to say very tactfully, well, boss, I understand that there are times when there's a legitimate reason to read one of an email I send from work, but couldn't we do something to make sure that it only happens when it's a legitimate work-related reason? Couldn't we at least have a policy that says IT shouldn't read my email unless you ask them to, or unless they come up with some justification as to why they're doing it ahead of time and make a record of it? The boss might say, okay, sure. I don't want the IT techs reading your personal love letters. We'll draft a policy to keep them from being so damn snoopy. If you have the kind of relationship with your boss, you can ask questions about some of the policies. And because some of the times you don't have any protection at work, it's because your boss doesn't want you to. And sometimes you don't have any protection at work because the boss hasn't thought about it. The boss is busy worrying about the company. They're not worrying about when can IT read your email. If in a subject like that, the boss may not have any objection to giving you some privacy and might give you some if you raised it tactfully. So that can be an option too under the right relationship.
Does anyone else who hasn't gotten the chance to ask a question want to either say it out loud or I can read it out in the chat if you want? Well, keep sending them in the chat. I do have a question. What are your thoughts on how COVID-19 has impacted workers' rights and particularly how the challenges that remote work has for protecting your rights as a worker?
Well, working at home doesn't change the fundamental relationship that you're still an at-will employee and your boss can fire you for any damn reason they want. But it does, in a couple of ways, give some protection. One is because it's harder to find employees now than it used to be. And if you're more valuable to your boss because you're a little harder to get, they're going to be a little less quick to fire you for some dumbass reason like a comic strip on the bulletin board or a bumper sticker on your car. The other thing is that when you're working remotely, your boss doesn't really know much about what you're doing except your work. Your boss can't fire you for a bumper sticker on your car if you're working remotely. It doesn't change, it doesn't really give you more rights that you're remote, but it does mean your boss doesn't have as many opportunities to be arbitrary towards you. Just remember to stay off the employer network when you're doing anything except work.
I think we have time for one or two more. Ben asked in the chat, what role do you see unions playing now and in the future?
And one of the real tragedies of our time is that there aren't enough people who join unions. Unions aren't perfect. No human institution is perfect, and that includes unions. But you are better off in a union than not being in a union. Union employees make, on the average, 20% more than people doing the same job in non-union companies. The benefits are better in unionized companies, and in every collective bargaining agreement in the country, there is a clause that says you can only be fired for just cause. And if you get fired and you don't think the reason was legitimate, you can go to an arbitrator, an independent arbitrator who will decide if it was a legitimate firing or not. Why anybody ever votes no in a union election is a mystery to me. It's a real tragedy. Sadly, unions they're slowly dying. Every year, the number of employees in unions is a little lower than the time before. The only thing I can say to any of you is if you're ever in a company and there's a union election, for God's sake, vote yes. You will definitely be better off if you do. Oh, and if you're in a company and it's a crappy place to work, I'm sorry to say this, you may not want to be the person who starts the organizing drive, because if you do, there's a very good chance you'll get fired. And you can file a claim with the National Labor Relations Board, and a couple of years later, they'll give you an order to reinstate, which you're not going to do because you'll have taken another job. You don't want to go back to an employer now. And they'll give you a check for the amount, whatever amount you earned less in the new job you had to take than the job you had that they fired you from. They'll give you a check for that chump change. That's all you get out of it. So if you're a crusader, help start the union, but you got to be brave because it's dangerous. And if you're not a crusader, when somebody else starts the crusade and gets the election going, be smart and vote to give yourself a raise and some protection.
But we have about 3 minutes left, so time for one more question. Does anyone have any last thoughts for Mr. Maltby? I just wanted to say that that was very insightful. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. If anybody comes up with any questions tomorrow morning they wish they had asked, just, find a way to get me an email and I'll try to answer them.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and send your email in the
Yeah,
chat. So
just give them my email so people can just come to me directly. Always happy to answer questions.
sounds good. Well, thank you so much for speaking to us, Mr. Maltby. We would all do a round of applause, but we'll do virtual applause for now.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
Around, but thank you for speaking to us. I'm going to pass this over to Haley right now to start our work equity panel. And just so you all know, we will have a bio break at the end of the work equity panel before we begin the second half of the conference. Haley, go ahead.